the Justice Department is opening an investigation into whether the Minneapolis Police Department is engaging in illegal conduct. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced the sweeping probe this morning. The DOJ will examine whether the MPD allows officers to conduct unlawful practices that promote or allow systemic wrongdoing. Now, that is in addition to a potential round of federal civil rights charges against convicted murderer Derek Chauvin. Garland says the DOJ will release a public report and impose changes on the MPD if an investigation finds wrongdoing. The Attorney General explained why he believes this probe is necessary.
Most of our nation's law enforcement officers do their difficult jobs honorably and lawfully. I strongly believe that good officers do not want to work in systems that allow bad practices. Good officers welcome accountability because accountability is an essential part of building trust with the community, and public safety requires public trust.
Derrick Johnson is the president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and he joins me now from Middleburg, Virginia. Derek, welcome. Great to have you with us. So what would you hope that this investigation by the Justice Department uncovers and ultimately changes?
Well, ultimately, we want to see a new standard in policing, a new relationship between the police and community. And fortunately, the police chief in Minneapolis also embraced that notion. I commend him and the officers to tear down the blue wall of silence and actually testify against Derek Chauvin. And I met with the police chief this past Monday along with Congresswoman Karen Bass, and he is as open and as focused as ever. In fact, he came up through the police ranks and had to file a lawsuit against this department because of the discriminatory practice. So DOJ going in, they will have support from the leadership as we create a new standard of policing, not only for this agency, but for agencies across the country.
So we just saw the reaction on Facebook from Darnella Frazier, that brave young teenage girl who filmed the act of Chauvin murdering George Floyd. But what does it say to you about the reforms we desperately need, considering that without that video, it's entirely possible the verdict and the subsequent global movement may have never happened?
Well, no teenager should have to witness what she witnessed, and her courage to video it is important. 30 years ago, what came to light with the Rodney King video is what African Americans have been saying for decades, that our community individuals have been terrorized and brutalized and killed by police. That shed light in 1992 with Rodney King. What we see with George Floyd now can further our advocacy to reform police. This is about trust and safety. African Americans want to be able to trust law enforcement agencies and officers that patrol in our communities and feel safe in our communities. We believe that good police officers, they exist, and we embrace those good police officers, but we must weed out bad actors. And that's why we are pushing for federal policy changes to do away with qualified immunity, create a publicly facing national database of police misconduct so officers cannot go from one agency to the next. And then finally, in Minnesota, they have this unique law around arbitration that had Derek Chauvin not been found guilty through their arbitration rules, although he was fired by the police chief, he could have come back and been reinstated into the job. 50% of the law officers who are fired by the city of Minnesota are put back, Minneapolis are put back on the agency because of this crazy arbitration law they have in the state of Minnesota.
No, you know, you make a great point there, because I believe there were 18 citations already against Derek Chauvin, before his fatal run-in with George Floyd. So, it does make you wonder how many citations are necessary before a police officer is disciplined or even, taken off the beat, taken off the job.
Absolutely. And so some of the problems that we see that are so systemic goes beyond just the agency. It's about the culture. It's about the fraternal order police, that local that's there. It's about state law reform, and it's definitely about federal policy to create a new floor of accountability so that people can restore or gain trust in law enforcement and feel safe.
Right. Well, so let's talk about some of the practical solutions. President Biden called the verdict, as you did, basic accountability and a step toward justice. And he said the U.S. cannot stop here. This is something that we're hearing again and again from activists as well. The president again put the onus on Congress to act. Let's listen.
We also need Congress to act. George Floyd was murdered almost a year ago. There's meaningful police reform legislation in his name. You just heard the vice president speak of it. She helped write it. Legislation to tackle systemic misconduct in police departments, to restore trust between law enforcement and the people they're entrusted to serve and protect. But it shouldn't take a whole year to get this done.
So, Derek, is the president being realistic here that a divided Congress can get 60 votes with 10 Republicans to enact significant structural police reform? Or do you believe that he and Democrats should take action themselves on this?
Well, first of all, this administration has taken action with the announcement this morning that the Justice Department is going to investigate what's really going on with Minneapolis Police Department. That's really important. That shows executive action because that's his cabinet. Secondly, Congress must act. Congresswoman Karen Bass did her part. She figured out the procedural opportunity to move the George Floyd police reform bill out of the House of Representatives in a new Congress without going through all the committees. Now it's resting with the Senate. And I have trust that Senators Cory Booker, Senator Tim Scott, they can come up with a solution because they understand the value of accountable policing. It blows my mind to realize that many conservatives, they hate unions except the police union. We have to allow for accountability. Good cops want to see good cops. Why should they be forced to protect bad actors because it makes all of them look bad?
Right. You know, can we get into some of the specific things which I think have been suggested? Because I think it's so important that this dialogue, this conversation continue. You know, some of the things that I have heard suggested is that police officers should be, forced or mandated to live in the districts in which they police so that they are members of the community. I mean, I think at the very least, police officers should recognize the people in their community, in the communities that they police. They should recognize the individuals. They should know these people on a certain level. And I think that goes a long way towards humanizing them.
Oh, absolutely. There are far too many agencies allow police officers not only to live in the jurisdictions they're patrolling, they're not familiar with the cultural nuances of those communities. They don't respect or see the people as human. They see them as criminal. And as a result, there's a disconnection between law enforcement officers in particular cases and the actual communities that they are patrolling. And these are communities that are paid their fair share in taxes. They are covering the cost for safety, and yet they have no trust because their lived experience have caused harm. It's been harmful. I grew up in a community where I was harassed. Many African-American men across the country have similar stories. We have to talk to our sons. So we need individuals who are serving and protecting to come from the very communities that they are serving and protecting. That's also important to establish a new baseline of respectability in law enforcement.
And what are some other changes that you'd like to see enacted? Do you think it's important that more police chiefs perhaps are African American, or there are more members of the force of color that are policing areas that are more heavily Black and brown communities?
Well, diversity in all settings are important, but we have to address qualified immunity. No one should be able to operate above the law. A person's badge should not be a shield to accountability. Second, we have to establish a federal registry of police misconduct. So law enforcement officers cannot go from agency to agency, and the infractions they created at the prior agency don't follow them. And the public should be apprised of what's taking place. There needs to be more aggressive training to de-escalate scenarios. Deontay White was killed for a traffic stop and a misdemeanor warrant. That makes no sense. We had a 15-year-old child killed yesterday, hour before the reading of the verdict, and she was the person calling the police for assistance. We have to have more training around de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. And then finally, not only should there be diversity among the ranks, there has to be diversity in the decision-making across the country so that we can have a more humane approach on how we communicate with communities, that we have training and support from social workers for communities that live in trauma, that we beef up resources for mental health professionals, because so many of these calls are involving individuals who have mental health episodes. And if we don't see those that we are serving and protecting as human, we won't treat them as human. And that's what's being displayed across the country.
That's a big one. I'm glad you brought up that point. The mental health calls, which really are an undue burden on our police departments, and they are not trained to handle them, and they too often end tragically. Well, Derrick Johnson, thank you so much. We've run out of time, but we really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.